Today on Sekulow, as evidence for the lab theory grows, what did Dr. Fauci and the NIH know, and when did they know it? We'll talk about that today on Sekulow. The first thing I would like to know from all of these Fauci emails, and we took our time, I had our team going through this because though this news was breaking last week, it was thousands upon thousands of emails. So you want to figure out what's the most relevant for the audience and the discussion that we are having today on the broadcast, and Rick Grinnell will be joining us as well. But it takes me back to this. We do all this FOIA work. In fact, we have a FOIA on this specific issue to the NIH. We will likely have to file a lawsuit as part of this FOIA. These news agencies, BuzzFeed, which is not exactly the most prestigious of any, mostly it's a bunch of quizzes for teenage girls. But yet they filed a FOIA. So did the Washington Post. I guess it is somewhat more respected as a large journalist, where they would have the lawyers to do this. But no indication they had to go to court to get thousands of emails during the pandemic, while it's still ongoing, from a current government official about something with national security revelation. Also, they did this to Rick Grinnell. They got his emails without court order, and they dumped them all.
In Rick's, I think they gave him like next to no notice and just sent them out there and said, here they are. They're from the Director of National Intelligence.
Right off the bat, I think that this reeks of Washington, D.C. What happened is Washington has no news. Washington is, I think the Trump derangement syndrome is coming to it's not done, but it's kind of calming down. They're looking for, okay, what's the truth about COVID? If none of these theories about the bats make sense. So suddenly, now Washington, D.C. has made Fauci the bad guy and basically ruined his career. He's starting to.
And he's trying to go on an offensive campaign on saying, well, it was just in the beginning. We were just trying to figure this out. What's interesting is Jonathan Karl on ABC said, well, Donald Trump, Andy, may have been right that this, in fact, was intentionally created in a lab in China, but he was giving us so much other nonsense we just couldn't believe it until now. I guess he was right.
Yeah, it must have killed him to have to admit that. To admit that Donald Trump was right on anything must have been something that ABC News had to swallow like a rock. I mean, the president was right. He was right on what he said, but now the liberal Democratic media is having to admit that, and I know that it's killing him, Jay.
No, there's no doubt about it. The question is here, what does this mean? And it's really, folks, what we need to concentrate on, Jordan, is this is a national security issue. It's not pointing fingers on should you wear a mask or not wear a mask. Those were in there, but you know what? That's inconsequential in the scheme of things. What's big here is, what are the national security, geopolitically, too, ramifications on this? Rick Grinnell, our senior advisor on those issues, will be joining us later in this broadcast.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and the back and forth, the dismissal outright that China could have had anything to do with this in a lab, when our own president was telling us they did, and the intel pointing that way, it appears, but yet there was a decision, and it looks like, I'll just read this quickly this was from Vanity Fair. It said, in one State Department meetings, officials seeking to demand transparency from the Chinese government say they were told by colleagues not to explore the Wuhan Institute of Virology's gain-of-function research because it may bring unwelcome attention to U.S. government funding of it. Yeah. So were we funding the creation of COVID-19 in the Wuhan lab? That is another question now, because, this is coming from Vanity Fair. So we got Washington Post, Vanity Fair, BuzzFeed. These were the ones who were going after the President Trump most of his 4 years.
For saying that this was, possibly created intentionally at a lab in Wuhan, China, which apparently looks like the evidence, that's where it's pointing. And now they're doing their apologies, but a little too late.
Yeah, exactly. And, of course, all the implications this has for the future as well, because we know that how this pandemic affects our economy. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Sekulow. A lot of this focusing in on there's an email. This dates back to February 1st, and we
need to set that up too. February 1st is when we first started getting word that this was a serious issue that could have big implications. It was just a month later that the country was shut down, 6 weeks later.
So it's to Fauci from someone who works with outside of this in the scientific world. And it's an article. We have the article right here. This was mining the coronavirus genomes for clues to the outbreak's origins. And again, it was in Science magazine, and this is a pretty thorough article for scientists by scientists. And in the email, this scientist to Anthony Fauci actually was sent on January 31st. I mean, this is people sending emails at 10:30 at night on New Year's Eve. Yeah, I mean, not New Year's Eve, January 31st, but on a Friday night.
I'll tell you what we were doing midnight on January 31st, 2020. Preparing for the next day of the impeachment trial.
Yeah, I mean, so they knew this was coming. They're sending emails at 10:30 at night. But here's what's clear in this email. Hi, Tony. And then you go down. So they were talking about how they looked at it. So one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some of the features potentially look engineered. Well, if they were engineered, guess what that means? They didn't come from a bat to a human. But they go on further. I should mention that after discussions earlier today, and he mentions a number of scientists, all I guess that Fauci would know, Eddie, Bob, and Mike, so very casually written, and myself, all the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, i.e., this did not jump from an animal to animal. This had to be created by man. This was not part of the evolution of animals taking this to a level where it developed to such a high potency that they could then transfer this to humans.
Yeah, the big portion of this,
this was back in 2020.
Yeah, now what needs to be understood here is that what are the implications of this? Again, looking at it geopolitically. I'm going to go to Andy first, and then I got a political question for Jordan and Dan, but I want to go to Andy on this because, here you've got emails that are actually coming out. And these emails are saying very clearly that it's pointing towards, this is a year and almost a half ago, that this was intentionally created by a lab which the United States was helping to fund. Yet the talking point was it was created in a wet market in China from a bat transmission to a human.
Well, this idea of the bat transmission to a human, I think we can safely put that aside. There is nothing that points to this Dracula-like transmission from Bela Lugosi to a human being, and we need to set that aside once and for all. I think that the evidence is going to show, and I follow the evidence on this, and we need to investigate it completely and entirely, but the evidence is going to show that this was definitely engineered by a lab in the Wuhan Virology Institute, probably, no question about it, funded by the United States, which makes it doubly abhorrent to me, and that it was transmitted by the Chinese either through negligence or, in my view, intentionality to their own population, regardless of what was going to happen to their own population, Dr. Fauci notwithstanding, saying they wouldn't do this to their own population. Nonsense. Of course they would. They have no scruples with respect to that. And then ultimately to the entire world.
We've sent out, Than, a FOIA request to, in this particular case, it's to the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the Director of Information Management Office. And what we've sought is records pertaining to communications, knowledge, and efforts surrounding the breaking story that the Biden administration shut down, froze, delayed, paused, or repurposed an investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 outbreak initiated by previous administrations. Anthony Fauci's admission to Congress of U.S. funds benefiting the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the ODNI knowledge of and actions and investigations of the origin of COVID-19. Again, we're focusing on not who had a mask or who did not have a mask and whether he knew the masks were helpful or not helpful. Put that all aside. I'm looking at the political ramifications and the geopolitical ramifications. Than?
Yeah, from the very beginning, Jay, we've been focused on what the federal government and the House and the Senate, quite frankly, should have been focused on back in January of 2020. We want to know the truth, and we want to know it for two reasons, Jay. Number one, if the Chinese were responsible for this, as it increasingly looks like they were, they need to be held to account. But maybe even more important than that, Jay, the reason we've issued this FOIA is to make sure that this never happens again, or at least that the United States does everything within our power to make sure that those responsible, that we don't don't partner with them in the future so that there's not another pandemic going forward. Jay, one of the very specific things that we're asking for in this FOIA is why did this administration suspend the investigation started by Secretary Pompeo to investigate this lab leak? We all know now that it is the most likely scenario, and quite frankly, anybody that looked at it seriously knew that it was a very high probability from the beginning. The last administration was looking into it. Jay, we want to know why this administration suspended it because, quite frankly, even if it ended up not to be the case, not investigating it to a conclusion, that is totally irresponsible.
Well, it changes the way in which we engage, Jordan, on an international level here.
Yeah, I mean, and it's upsetting, too. I think that Dr. Fauci needs to be fired from these emails. He needs to be, his career should be heavily tarnished, and whatever other population control measures he would love to implement around the world, maybe they won't be, because he works closely with the Gates Foundation, which is all about how many children they can abort that are poor around the world, because it's a population control group. Because I guess, the billionaires only want the world for themselves. The idea, though, is this. He sat down, on Fox and Friends, April 2020. This is his direct quote. "It boggles my mind how when we have so many diseases that emanate out of the usual human-animal interface that we don't just shut it down. I don't know what else has to happen to get us to appreciate that, because that's what we're going through right now." There was he says right there, we are going through human-animal interface. And this is a direct result of that. I mean, and again, this was bats infecting humans and these wet markets in China. And again, those have been linked before. Senator Rubio had talked about this. There's been SARS, there's been MERS, and they were able to find the animal origin within a few months. So if you can't find the animal origin in over a year, suddenly what people were talking about a year ago that was just dismissed outright as conspiratorial, it was anti-Asian, broadly to suggest that there was possibly at a minimum and in a best case scenario an accidental leak. I mean, no one is saying that because you could prove through anything in this that it was intentional. That would be a step that, again, Intel would have to deal with and verify.
And because that would be an act of war.
But what we know is that
they did that.
These individuals, for instance, the scientist who was quoted in that piece, by the way, who emailed Dr. Fauci about the expectations that it's inconsistent with the evolutionary theory, it looks engineered, he's now taken down his Twitter account. So these people are being inundated with those who still do have the Trump derangement syndrome.
Right.
How dare you? How dare you have questioned, this Dr. Fauci no one had ever heard of before. And I think that there was this idea. We have a new blog up from Allie Holston from
Not quite up.
our
Is
team.
it up yet?
Yeah, it's up at ACLJ.org about what did Fauci know and when. This was the idea that the American people at the beginning of this thing wanted to trust someone who came not from politics,
medically,
came from science and medicine, came from the NIH, a place that shouldn't be playing partisan politics.
Yep.
And that again, not that they'd get everything right and perfect, but if they made a definitive statement,
we could take it
and
trust it.
But we all started realizing these definitive statements didn't make sense. It started out with things like masks not working. But I think that they probably did work for a lot of situations. You could see there was no flu in America, and so, but it was definitive all the time. I think that was his biggest problem.
Always definitive, but what I'm concerned about, and we're going to get to the bottom of this in our FOIA
mocking
litigation.
The people on the other,
yes, mocking anybody else. But Andy, here's what we're doing: we're in discussions, which will end up in court, with the current administration to find out why they shut down these investigations.
That is a critical thing that I want to know too, and we're going to get to the bottom of it, Jay. But Secretary Pompeo had started an investigation as to what was going on in the Wuhan lab and our funding of it and so forth. And suddenly the Biden administration cuts that out and suspends it. Why? What's there to hide? Why don't you want to know what the facts are? Why are you not wanting to know what exactly went on in China with respect to this virus? What is the reason for this? What is behind it? What are the political implications of it? Why is Joe Biden hiding it? Why is his administration being elusive? These are the things that we want to find out.
All right, we come back. Rick Renell will be joining us in the next segment of the broadcast. We first talked to Rick about this when it was just starting to shift. I mean, this idea was just starting to shift, and now it's full blown. It's like the media, they're in their apology tour. They all have to get in their apologies at some time on TV. I'm sorry that we called Donald Trump and his supporters, liars for suggesting that possibly
But we had to.
That the President of the United States was receiving the highest level of intel that Jonathan Karl would never, ever receive in his entire life, that possibly said, hey, this may have been a lab leak. By the way, I think that's being nice to the Chinese, calling it lab leak and not lab intentional.
Or certainly negligence.
Yeah, I mean, or the bad actors that could have gotten involved.
We don't know that one yet.
We'll be right back. All right, so we're learning more and more as the time goes on. We wanted to have time with our team too to go through these emails from Anthony Fauci that were released. Rick Rennell, our senior advisor, joining us now as well. And Rick, one of the things that I love about these emails is BuzzFeed puts in a FOIA request, and they get your emails, they get Fauci's emails. We put in requests. We're in court for 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, right.
But in these emails, what we see is there was definitely not this certainty that we were all being told, and that now that the Trump derangement syndrome is, I guess, it's starting to come down a little bit in Washington, D.C. Yeah, cooling off a little in Washington, D.C. And the science is starting to catch up to reality, and the reality now is that you basically see all the Sunday shows and the Washington reporters on an apology tour. We shouldn't have told you that Donald Trump was lying about this. This idea, again, that, when we first talked about it, it was a big shift that they were even considering it. Now it's the leading theory, Rick, that this was lab created, and that Dr. Fauci was learning about this from his colleagues before this was even declared a pandemic in the United States.
Look, I keep harping on this, but if you go back to the DNI website, April 30th, 2020, there is a statement from the entire intelligence community. An intelligence community-wide statement is extremely rare. And in that statement, we make very clear that this started in China and it's either in the lab or in the wet markets. And we briefed reporters to say the lab leak is the leading hypothesis. This is where our intelligence community is going. This is what they are investigating. And since then, of course, the people in Washington who just protect the ruling party, the Democrats, have completely changed their tune. And yet I can attest to the fact we told Washington Post reporters, CNN reporters, New York Times reporters of this exact lab leak theory, and they ignored it because it didn't fit into their politics at the time.
Rick, one of the things that I'm concerned about is I don't want to get into, who should wear a mask and who should not wear a mask, and was Fauci right on the mask or not right on the mask. What I want to focus in on is what are the geopolitical ramifications for all of this? If, in fact, the Chinese government, which is what the Wuhan lab is, did intentionally create this. Now, they will say they were intentionally creating it. They'll never admit they intentionally created it. There'll be medical justifications possibly that they may put forward. But what are the geopolitical ramifications when they never have admitted what they actually have done here, which created a worldwide pandemic?
The first one that comes to mind is Donald Trump froze out the World Health Organization money, the U.S. money going to WHO. And he did that because the evidence shows that they were in bed with China, that they were not willing to be tough on Chinese researchers, on the Chinese policy positions. And one area that we were trying to make progress in is to get other countries to freeze out the WHO, to make substantive changes to the international body. And we were onto something, and we were making some progress with the Europeans until the Democrats completely tried to make this a partisan issue, and they defended the WHO. And now the Biden administration has returned the money there. So on a global scale, we, the United States, are struggling with our credibility of whether or not we're going to allow the Chinese to take over UN agencies or not. The world knows that the Chinese in control of the WHO are a dangerous path. We were making progress on it, but we've had to dial that back. I don't think we're going to be able to be successful internationally until we recognize that the international organization designed to protect us from global pandemics is completely controlled by the people pushing pandemics.
No, I think you're right. I remember back when you were in office and I was representing at that point the president. I remember that this whole issue, as it was maturing over the summer months, as we got to April and May, we were in, and the president clearly, and he said it publicly, was concerned that this virus was created by the Chinese Communist Party, that there should have been ramifications for this. There should have been a cost to this economically. And he talked about this in a speech he gave the other day about sanctions and tariffs and other things that politically could have been leveraged to have the Chinese pay a penalty for this. My great fear here is, Rick, is that we're going to find all of this out and nothing is going to happen. Nothing will change. And we will still give them money.
That the moment has passed us. I fear the same thing, Jay, is because when we had the world's attention because of this, that's the time to act. And too many times in the international community will punt, or the Chinese or the Russians or some other bad actor will move to, let's say a 3-month report. Let's study this for 3 months. They want to push it down. They want to make time go by, because as time goes by, the international community loses its fervor and its unity in doing something. So I fear the same thing, that we might have missed it. However, the Democrats have a chance to lead the world. Imagine if the Democratic Party would just completely change now and say, we see the evidence. We see that the Chinese not only were responsible for this, but what they did to the rest of the world in hiding it, that the cover-up is really the economic devastation that we need to be focused on.
Yeah, I mean, because, again, I go back to this. I want to play this soundbite from Dr. Fauci, because, again, this was back in, we've got one April 17th, and then it goes right into one on May 4th back in 2020, so more than a year ago. Take a listen.
The mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human. This could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated, the way the mutations have naturally evolved.
And that right there, Rick, is the serious problem, because that's when everybody said, well, President Trump is a liar, his administration liar, the people out there in the administration saying that this
the Chinese didn't do anything wrong.
The Chinese absolutely couldn't have done anything wrong. Maybe there's problems with how they handle these wet markets, but it's not. He says this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. Now we're talking about, but in his emails in 2020, he's talking about how we may have funded gain-of-function research, which is artificially or deliberately manipulating a virus.
Yeah, look, there's so much evidence that shows the cover-up that the Chinese were doing. Or let's also be clear, the Chinese not allowing there to be flights internally from Wuhan out to the rest of China, but allowing international flights. Now, they knew exactly the problem. They shut down Wuhan. They shut down areas where they could, and they played fast to cover up because they didn't want the rest of the world to somehow beat up on them. And then they went into an aggressive spy push where they used the PPE that they controlled with the world. The world needed PPE, the Chinese knew it, and they used it against the rest of the world.
So in an internal memo that was obtained by a Vanity Fair, Jordan mentioned this earlier, the former acting assistant secretary of State's Department of Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. Now, let me read that again. The assistant secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance wrote that the staff from two bureaus, his own and the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, warned leaders within his bureau not to pursue an investigation into the origins of COVID-19 because it would, quote, open up a can of worms. Jordan, that is where it ends at the bottom. That is in the internal information.
Yeah, so they knew that there was the there. They don't want the American people to know what that is. How much of our taxpayer dollars? Because, when they say $600,000 over 5 years, I mean, that's nothing. So that's not a lot of resources. You start adding that up, though, with that's what was known, what was not known, what was the money being used for. But opening up a can of worms, the idea, again, that's what our government is there to do. They are there to open the can of worms, to figure out why we're facing problems. But the bureaucracy surrounding itself, protecting itself, I don't know if they'll be able to get away with it this time because the media has shifted. They are apologetic for saying that those who, like all the scientists who were telling Dr. Fauci that he was wrong, or at least to temper his words, that maybe they were right and that Fauci was wrong. He was not, the be-all, end-all on every single subject. And I think it goes to this, though. How long will he be kept around? I mean, it'll be interesting to see now, because
even the media in the left,
had tried to remove him, it would have been like another impeachment.
Yeah, exactly.
How long is Joe Biden going to really let this guy go on, use government salary to go on TV to defend himself so he can then sell a book?
But that's precisely why we are going to get this information at the ACLJ.